Hi G2, I'm Matt. Some of you will know me, some of you won't. I was at G2 up until July, 2 Julys ago. So when was that? July 2022. But since then I've gone on to start training to be a vicar over at St Paul's, Holgate and St Barnabas, Lehman Road. The book that you're looking at, Failure, which is this series is based on, is a book that I looked at with St Paul's and St Barnabas earlier in the year. So Hannah asked if I would do a video. For those who were around when I took part in doing some of the small group videos, you'll see I'm not in my cabin, unfortunately. My neighbours have got a party going on, so it's a little bit too noisy to be outside, unfortunately. But it's great to be back with you for this session. Like everybody now, just close your eyes and think back to that one event that probably happened some point between the ages of 5 and 15. That every time you think about it makes you cringe. That one event that you don't really want to tell anybody about, and you can't bear even to really think about it, yet it keeps coming up in your mind every so often. Or maybe that's just me. So I'd like you to open your eyes now. Tell the person next to you what that event is. Now some of you, don't worry, you don't actually have to do this. I was asking you to do that because I wanted two things to happen. I wanted you to feel internal shame and a fear of external shame. Because those stories, those ones that make us cringe, that we don't want anybody to know, really show us our sense of shame. Our fear of people finding out some of the worst things about us, of people finding out that the self that we project is not the same as the self that actually exists. And so we have two different types of shame. We have that internal sense of feeling that you probably immediately felt when I asked you to think of that story of what makes you cringe, and probably also felt it the second I said tell it to the person next to you. And that feeling of shame is to do with our identity. It's that sense of being found out, that we are not the way that either we like to think we are, or that other people know us to be. But there is also a sense of external shame. That shame of wondering how other people are going to react, of how they're going to make you think and feel about yourself in response to what they learn about you. And this session in particular, we are looking at that. How do we respond to individual failure? Both our internal response and our external response. Because shame really actually is at the root of our fear of failure. We fear shame. And so we fear failure because of how failure can give us shame. And shame is becoming more and more relevant in today's society. For a long time in the West, shame has been something internal. It's been an internal motivator to make us do the right things. And when I say make us do the right things, I don't mean as if it's not something we didn't want to do, but rather that that was the culture's way of making sure people did the things that kept us together. It was internally motivated. We didn't really need people outside of us to do that. But what we are seeing with our culture today is that we are shifting to an external form of shame. No longer are we driven by shame in terms of discerning what is right and wrong, by what goes on inside of us. What we are seeing is actually how we determine right and wrong is external. We see this particularly on social media, that tweets from 10 years ago that people would never have thought were wrong, suddenly people outside of them have determined that it's wrong and have determined that that person should feel shame. And this is generating a huge amount of anxiety because this isn't a way that we know how to operate. If we go back 2 generations ago, this idea of external shame in the way that it is so prevalent today and changes so quickly on what should and shouldn't feel shame, would have been completely alien. There was an external form of shame that we see a few generations ago. Just look at Downton Abbey and the way that people interacted. But it's not quite the same thing. Today, our sense of shame, and the converse of that being honour, is actually shaped by victimhood. Shame comes from victimizing a victim group, and honour comes from either being a part of a victim group or of protecting a victim group. Where do you see this today? Take time now, pause the video, ask the people in your group, where do you see this external shame acting out in society? So I'm sure you had a lot to talk about there, and I'm guessing social media was the main place. But we're starting to see this creep more and more into everyday life outside of screens, outside of the digital. This sense of I need to claim that I am part of a victim group, and that if anyone attacks me when I'm part of that victim group, actually they should feel shame. Now, in one sense, this makes it easier and harder for us when we then turn to the Bible and we look at shame. Because our culture is becoming more shame and honour based, actually we can spot where that is occurring in the Bible easier. We can see it with Adam and Eve, particularly in Genesis chapter 3. We can see it between David and Nathan in 2 Samuel 12, when Nathan confronts David about what he did with Bathsheba and her husband. And we see it with Jesus and the way that he healed people, those outcasts, the people who in the society at the time would have been feeling and experiencing a huge amount of shame externally. But there are some crucial differences. In the Bible, shame is mostly external. It's not internal. You'll notice if you read through 2 Samuel 12, David doesn't actually think he's done anything wrong until Nathan publicly reveals his wrongdoing. And we see this time and time again throughout the Bible. It's why we can read it sometimes and find it quite harsh, particularly in the Old Testament. But that's because shame was external, mostly. And so people's sense of right and wrong came from other people telling them where they had done wrong. It's why with Israel we so repeatedly see the reading of the law after they have turned away from God. It's because that external telling of what they had done wrong was where they then realized and experienced that shame. But there is also a key difference in terms of how honor is placed. So in the Bible, particularly in the New Testament, honor was the opposite of shame. And honor was something that was placed externally. It wasn't an internal sense of I have lots of honor. Rather, honor was how you got rid of shame. And there were different ways that you could do this. Someone who was a higher status than you in society for a variety of different reasons, if they took you under their wing, then you received honor from them. Likewise, if you were able to provide something for them, do a job for them, you received honor because you then became associated with that person. But similarly, you could lose honor by being associated with the wrong people. And in losing honor, you then experienced shame. But crucially, the restoring of honor, having experienced shame, it was the individual person's responsibility to restore their own honor. It was up to them to become honoring in people's eyes rather than shameful. And we see with Jesus where he starts to correct that, and he is the one that starts to give honor to people. But primarily, the way society worked at the time was you were responsible for getting back your own honor. Now that's important when we then start to think about our own shame today, because we can start to see in the Bible actually how God deals with shame. And interestingly, actually God deals with those two types of shame we've already looked at, that internal shame and that external shame. And I've got two passages that I'd like you to read in your groups together. Pause the video and read these two passages. The first one is Romans 6, verses 5 to 11. The second one is Colossians 3, 1 to 4. So pause the video now and read through those two passages together. So in those two passages, God is dealing with internal shame and external shame. He's dealing with that internal sense of people are going to find out that how I show myself to others is not how I actually am on the inside. He's dealing with that sense of identity. And he does that by showing that actually we have died with Jesus. Our old selves, that shameful self, whatever it is that we had done, in Jesus, that old self has died. And a new self has been born. A new self that is free from the shame that we've experienced before. Free from those failures that we have made that cause that shame. Now, it's important here to say that this freedom from shame doesn't mean that if we have seriously hurt people, we can just pretend like we haven't done it. It doesn't mean we can say to those people, you can't feel upset with me anymore. You can't be upset with me anymore because now I am a new person in Jesus. We still need to be accountable for the things that we have done wrong, and especially once we are Christians, where we find ourselves slipping back into that old self. We need to be accountable and we need to say when we have done things wrong. But fundamentally, those who have placed their faith in Jesus, those who have trusted in his death and resurrection to deal with their shame are new people. That old identity, that old self has died, and we have been reborn. And then in the second reading, there is this dealing with the external sense of shame. And now this could be particularly helpful for those of us who struggle with anxiety. Because we increasingly are becoming an anxious age. And I want to be really important to distinguish here between genuine mental health concerns that are to do with anxiety and just the general sense of anxiety that a lot of us seem to be living with nowadays. If you have mental health concerns to do with anxiety, then you should see someone that can help you with that. But all of us, to a certain extent, will be experiencing the second sense of anxiety, and this comes from this external sense of shame, particularly around that area that we call cancel culture. Now, I know at this point Luke Smith is probably going to be going, yes, let's talk about it. No one can cancel me. We just got to talk about it. But for some of us, that might be really, really scary. We might be really worried about how other people are going to interpret us, especially if they find out that we are Christians. And this was a pressing issue for the Christians at the time. They were hated by the Romans. They went through various stages of persecution, firstly from Jewish leaders and then from Roman leaders later on. And they really needed to know how to deal with this external shame. How do I deal with the fact that I am a new person in Jesus, but I know that people are going to hate that? I know that people are going to dislike me precisely because I follow Jesus. And so Paul, in writing to the Colossians, tells them how they can deal with that. He tells them to find their honour in a different place. As I was explaining that system of shame and honour in the first century, I was talking about how you can get honour from someone greater than you. And that's true. But there are actually levels to that honour. The greatest honour you could get would be from one of the gods, one of the Roman or Greek gods. If for some reason someone had decided that they'd shown those gods, small g, had shown honour to that person and that had been evident to other people around them, they were almost untouchable. That was partly what was surrounded the Caesars and the emperors at the time. They were seen as people, as mini gods. And so they received honour at the level of gods. And so they couldn't do anything that would bring them shame. They had someone that gave them so much honour that they could never be put to shame by other people, never be put to shame by criticisms. It probably helped that a lot of the emperors were basically crazy. But that basic principle of the person who is giving me honour is far greater than the person who is shaming me, was alive and well at the time. And that is what Paul, in writing to the Colossians in this passage, is telling them to see. Look where your honour is coming from. If you feel that shame, if you're worried and anxious about that shame, about being a Christian, of being known to be a Christian, of being known to be that bigot at work or at school or around friends, you're worried how people will respond to you telling them the gospel, return back to these 4 verses, because this is where our honour as Christians come from. We have been raised up with Christ. We have been seated at God's right hand with Jesus. Our lives are now hidden with Christ in God. And when Jesus returns, we will appear with him in glory. Right now, if you are a follower of Jesus, you are receiving honour and glory from God, the living and true God, the one who has made the world, who has made all things, who sustains us from moment to moment, who is so powerful that if he forgot about us, we would stop existing. That is the God who gives each and every Christian honour. And if we compare that to the shame we might experience from the world, there's no contest. There is no comparison of the honour that we receive from God compared to the shame that we receive from others. And we might be sat there thinking, that's great, thanks for telling me that, Matt, but I still don't see how. And the final place is to look at that cross in a few different places in Galatians, but also in Colossians. Paul talks about the shame that Jesus experienced on the cross. For the early Christians, to bear the symbol of a cross was to bear the ultimate symbol of shame. And for them, it became a symbol of victory. Because it was at the cross that worldly shame was turned on its head. Because that was the place where God bore our shame. The internal shame and the external shame. And if God himself can subject himself to the shame that he experienced on the cross, then we can experience the shame that we will feel when we tell people that we're with him. There is no greater shame that we can experience than the shame that Jesus experienced on the cross. And so these are 3 of the ways that we can face our shame. We can face that sense of individual failure internally, that old self that has that shame has died, and we are now new people in Jesus. And externally, that we receive honour from God himself, and that the greatest shame that we could ever experience has already been borne by Jesus on the cross. So a final question for you to talk about in your groups. Where do you feel that shame most? Is it internal or is it external? And then pray for each other. Whatever it is where we feel that shame, we can pray to a God who already knows where we feel it, who is gracious, who has a throne of grace and encourages us to come to him with that shame, and he will deal with it for us. See you, GT.